Hello everyone, my name is Eirik. Welcome back into my studio here in Florence, Italy. Today's video is the second part in a series where we cover how to sculpt using a combination of knowledge of anatomy and structure, a small-scale maquette as reference, and a live model, of course. The idea being that we can achieve a pose that no model can hold for us. These are lessons I've learned throughout my years of sculpting, and in my opinion, lessons that will set you free to sculpt whatever pose you desire. In many ways, this video will help you understand how to sculpt like how at least I imagine Michelangelo would have sculpted when he sculpted in clay 500 years ago. If you enjoyed the video, like and subscribe, and if you want to learn more, check out my Patreon page where you can get instant access to over 50 hours of in-depth videos on all things sculpture. Let's get into it. Before starting to actually build or even locate points on the ribcage, I want to cover some parts of the armature in clay. Armature covered in clay gives me something to draw on or sculpt on, while if I don't have anything on the armature, things are just sort of floating in space and can be less locked in. By having some clay to place things on and draw on, I'll have a greater chance at iterating upon my first decisions and ideally therefore improving upon them. When it becomes time to build the ribcage, I don't simply build it. Because of the complicated pose, there is plenty to consider here, so a slow and methodical approach is going to yield the best results. Hopefully, results that I can trust and rely on throughout the rest of the project. I continue to observe my maquette on equal terms with the pelvis, and while doing so, I locate a point on the ribcage, namely the bottom of the sternum. The bottom of the sternum has a relationship to what's been built below it, the box, and it's this relationship that I'm currently investigating. The distance between the ACE's points and the bottom of the sternum can be measured, so its placement in height is fairly solidified. A vertical line dropped down from the bottom of the sternum and related to the box will place the bottom of the sternum left to right for me. To help find the height of the bottom of the sternum, it can be useful to know that the width of the box flipped vertically will usually take you up to about the bottom of the sternum. Now this is very much a more or less type of measurement, but it can't hurt when it comes to getting you into the ballpark at least. In order to find the position of the bottom of the sternum left to right, we need a good understanding of how the spine works. The spine functions like a spring. It bends as a C-shaped curve, not as an S-shaped curve when observed from the front and the back. It's an S-shaped curve when observed from the side, however, certainly depending on the pose. The spine exits the pelvis at 90 degrees to the tilt of the pelvis, travel up straight a short distance before doing most of its bending in a fist-sized area below the ribcage, which ends lower in the back than in the front, of course. Knowing this will help you. This means that there is a relationship between the tilt of the box and the egg. If the box is tilted a certain way, yet placed too far to the left, the spine will need to bend unnaturally to reach the ribcage, and it won't be able to do so convincingly. Now, while certainly anatomically possible, a bend like this is unlikely to occur, at least occur a lot, or to a great extent. If you enjoyed the video so far and you're one of the 69% of you watching that's not subscribed, do yourself and me a favor by hitting that subscribe button. You can also hit the thumbs up button. I do appreciate the support. Once located from the front above the pelvis, the bottom of the sternum should be connected to the pelvis using a center line. A center line is just a line representing the spine, and it's drawn on our work both in the front and in the back. If the center line can reach the bottom of the sternum from pelvis following the rules laid out above, then our work is plausible and could exist in real life. Next point that we will locate is the corners of the ribcage, which are more visual and not always so present, depending on the weight and size and shape of your model, but when they are, we're going to use them. They're not really an anatomical term either, it's more of an artistic term. It's where the ribcage turns sharply back in space, or from traveling down to traveling left or right from the side views. We have 2 points we can relate these corners to currently. On each side we can use one aces and the bottom of the sternum to place the corners of the ribcage. Since our ribcage is treated as a solid unit and its front is not in line with the front of the pelvis, it stands to reason that each corner of the ribcage is going to have a different relationship to the aces point below it. One is going to sit further forward and the other therefore has to sit further back. While the length of the sternum is not quite there yet, you can see that I've made myself a flat spot here that will keep the front plane of the ribcage clear and obvious to me. The pit of the neck from here on out, called the PON, is the next point on our ribcage we need to locate. The PON is the top of the ribcage in the front, and it ends higher in the back and is where the neck of the figure will start. At this point, it's fairly easy to locate since we've found the bottom of the sternum. The spine travels in a straight line through the ribcage, and it doesn't bend. There should therefore be a straight line connecting the bottom of the sternum to the PON. This is the center line which represents the placement of the spine inside the figure. Now, if you know the scale of your figure in relationship to the model, you can simply measure the length of the sternum on your model, convert to the scale you intend the figure to be in, and build the sternum to that dimension. The length of the sternum can't change since it's a solid bone with no articulation between the PON and the bottom of the sternum. Distances with articulation in between are unreliable in terms of measuring. Aces to PON is a useful measurement, but not something you should rely on since the distance between these two can change depending on the pose. You can sort of imagine that if you stretch your body out, the distance between your pelvis and the neck, your neck, is greater than if you try to sort of sit down and get your neck as close to the pelvis as possible. This distance can change because there's articulation in between the two bony points. Together with measuring, you should also use comparative measurement. Compare the length of the sternum to something you're certain about, like the width of the box, for example. You'll find that in most cases the length of the sternum is slightly less than the width of the box. I will locate the PON from the front and from the side. From the side, I compare its placement to something that's already been established. And if you're working from a live model, you can place the model's ribcage in the pose you intend to sculpt, and the rest of the body doesn't matter, so that can be doing whatever, and then compare where the PON is in relationship to the bottom of the sternum. If the model can position her pelvis and the ribcage in the correct pose for a little bit at least, then use information found on the box as well. If you're working from a maquette like me, you can compare to the box and to the parts of the ribcage already sculpted. The more cross-references that you can make, the better. You can see that I first build this wall-like structure from the side to locate the PON. This connects the PON to the bottom of the sternum and gives me the angle of the sternum in between these 2 points as well. Once I confirm this, I can build out the volume and connect front borders to the side borders in a more convincing and volumetric manner. Doing things this way means less clay will have to move if I decide that there are changes that need to be made to the placement of the PON. So only add volume once you feel certain about your borders. With the PON found, we can measure the angle from the PON to the C7, which is the top of our egg in the back. From the side view, we can observe the angle between the two. The C7 will usually sit higher than the PON, as the ribcage ends higher in the back than in the front. With the heights established, I can work on the width with confidence. There's always a relationship between heights and widths, and this can now be examined on a live model. As long as the pose is fairly close, there won't be any major changes to the relationship between the heights and the widths of the ribcage. Well, there won't be no matter the pose really, but visually, a massive change in pose can sort of fool the eye here. The width of the ribcage tends to be around the width of the box, in other words, aces to aces, on the pelvis. This will usually give us a very decent starting point, if nothing else, to build muscles and ribs on top of. The widest part of the ribcage is at the 8th rib, which sit in the middle between the bottom of the sternum and the bottom of the ribcage more or less. Keep in mind that some parts of the ribcage at the bottom disappears from view underneath the flesh. Depending on the pose, more or less can disappear, and this can also be asymmetrical. especially if the ribcage and pelvis is tilted at the different angles, like they are on this particular pose. The overall shape that we're trying to build our widths out to match is an egg shape, of course. The center line represents the spine, and we can only see evidence of the spine in the back and not in the front, of course. We do need a center line both in the front and the back, as drawn on the clay, and it's very important that these two center lines are the same and that they line up. I check at the top and the bottom of my sculpture if the center line lines up properly, using a tool to extend the center line further above my sculpture so that I can see the tilt of my center line in the front from the back, for example, and vice versa. Doing this now, when it's still just box and egg, is useful, since once we get legs and a head on there, it's going to be impossible to do so, because the legs and the head will block our ability to see the tool extending above the ribcage and below the pelvis. Thank you for watching until the end. If you enjoyed the video, remember to like and subscribe. And if you want to learn more, check out my Patreon page where you can get instant access to over 50 hours of in-depth videos on sculpture, mold making, and casting.